Welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer and thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And today I wanted to bring you a little tip for hemming knits. Now, it can be a little tricky to work with knits at home, especially if you don't have an overlocker. And when it comes to hems, even if you do have an overlocker, it may not have the cover stitch. Now, if you pull out a t-shirt, really any t-shirt, it will most likely have a cover stitch hem. They use this a lot on both the sleeves and the hem, like the bottom hem of the garment. And oftentimes they'll even use this around like the neckline. And only kind of really upscale sergers or overlockers will have this stitch. The majority of them don't even have the stitch. Sometimes you can get an extra machine that just does that cover stitch, but that can be a little bit pricey as well. So what is the deal with hems? Well, hems are tricky in knits just because they often get a lot of stretch to them. When we're getting in and out of knit garments, pulling them over our heads, there can be a lot of strain on these seams. So if you use just a regular lock stitch, so your sewing machine's regular stitch, it might break and then start to unravel. Now, if you use like a zigzag stitch or something like that, then your garments can have kind of a homemade look to them. And we want our garments to look really professionally finished and well done. So what other options are there? Well, I love a band hem. A band hem you'll see a lot on sweatshirts. They'll have like a band around the cuff and the hem, and usually it's a different type of knit, and it's a right-left knit. It will have a lot of elasticity to it, so it will shrink up, and it's often stitched on with some ease of the garment. So it will be eased on and will be like kind of shrinking the hem of the sweater together and the cuff. Now you may not want that finish, and you may not have the band in the right color. That's the trickiest part when sourcing materials for making sweatshirts and that kind of thing, is to get the fabric you want for your sweater and then the band in the same color when you're using different material. Now on a t-shirt, you probably don't even want different material, and especially if you're making kind of a dressier looking top. And that's where you can actually use the exact same fabric you use for the main part of the garment for the band itself, and you can either sew it on one-to-one, so there is no stretch or no easing of the band. It's not shrinking it together. Or if you do want to have a smaller hemline, you can add that on. Now, when it comes to the neckline, necklines can be tricky to finish just because there's a curve to it, and you don't want that band to be flapping around or gaping. So let's take a look at a garment, and I'll show you some tricks how to avoid that and how you can apply this type of a hem with different types of stitches, all with a really great result. What is that? How you can apply it with different types of stitches. So let's take a look at a garment, and I'll show you how you can apply this technique to any garment and get the result that you want, whichever result that is, with different types of stitching depending on what kind of a machine and stitch you have available to you. When pairing the right stitch to your knit project, you always need to think about where is the strain on the seam. In the case of the hem, there's a lot of stretch and strain side to side when we're putting the garment on, which is why you will most often see this cover stitch. This cover stitch is made up of about 3 threads typically, and has 2 rows of stitching on the front, and looks really nice and clean because the stitches look just like a regular lock stitch, but there's a lot more stretch to it because of the overlock type back. Now, even in the case of a cover stitch, it can still break. This jersey is obviously a lot stretchier even than the cover stitch, and it has broken and started to unravel here. But if we had done just a traditional lock stitch, it would have even less stretch and less durability to it. Now, in the case of a side seam, you can often get away with a traditional lock stitch just because there's not as much up and down strain as there is side to side. If we use a zigzag stitch on a side seam on a knit garment, sometimes it's not such a nice secure closure because the thread isn't running straight along the edge of where this seam will get the most strain. So matching up your stitch to the type of strain that the seam will experience, as well as what is the look that you want on the outside of your garment. Since we have lots of side-to-side strain on this seam, we might think that a zigzag stitch would be a great option. And it is if you are all right with the look of the zigzag stitch. Now, in the case of using a band, like I have here on this example, this is a wider band. You can really make the band whatever width you want. This one is about 1 3/4. You don't see the stitching, so if you stitch this band on with a zigzag stitch, there isn't that much strain on the seam this direction to pull the stitching apart where the one stitch goes away from the edge. But we do have that extra length of the zigzag so that we get a lot more stretch to our hem. So this is an example of what we're going to do today in a wider length, and here is a narrower length, and this is also a great example on the sleeve. I've eased the sleeve on somewhat. So whenever you ease the garment onto a smaller band, you're going to get some gathering depending on how much you ease it together. If it's just a small amount, you may not get any gathering. And of course, the more you ease on, the more gathering you'll get. Whereas here on the hem, I've done a 1-to-1 length. So the stitch line length of the garment is the actual length of my band. So this is a straight attachment. So here on the neckline, we have curves involved. And whenever you have an inside and an outside curve, you have a difference in length as well. So here you may want to ease on the neckband. And I've got this question before, is how much smaller do I need to make the band itself than the garment or the stitch line of the garment so that we don't get it standing up or flipping out? What I always recommend is just cut it 1-to-1. You will need less band than length of the stitch line of the garment, but depending on the curve, you'll need to ease different amounts for a really perfect fit. Here, where the curve is really sharp, on this neckline, it's a sharper curve, kind of the transition over the shoulder. You'll need to stretch that band a little bit more, so you'll need to ease more fabric on, just because the outside where it attaches is much longer than the inside. If we don't want to have extra length on the inside, then we need to shrink up that edge. Here where the curve is softer and at the back of the neck where it's virtually flat, you can almost do 1-to-1. So stating a specific percent of how much you should ease that neckband onto the neckline isn't 100% accurate, because you'll want to ease a different amount at different areas. In this case, I've left the center back seam open, and I'm going to finish closing that and the neckband together. If you don't want the seam allowance for your neckband to be on the outside, you want it to be on the inside, then start attaching that neckband 1 inch or 2 from the edge. Finish it all the way around, and then you'll know how long exactly do I need the length of this neckband to be to really create a perfect fit and for it to lay down nice and flat. So how would you go about adding this hem to a garment? Well, first you need to decide on what width. Visually, what width of a band do you want at the location, whether it be the neckline, the bottom hem, or the sleeve of the garment? And of course, do I want ease or do I want it a 1-to-1 in the length? And once you've decided on the finished width, then what you'll need to do is add your seam allowance, so whatever seam allowance you want on this band for attaching it, and then double that. So here I have the other side of the band for the sleeve, and it is double wide, and I've just ironed it in half. So we're gonna attach this right away. But the other thing that you need to think about when thinking about the width is that your garment is going to get longer, whether it's on the sleeve, the neckline will get smaller, and the hem for sure will also get longer. So if you want extra length on this garment, if you're finding it short, you can even add some extra length here. But if you're also looking to create only a specific length, you'll need to deduct that length from the garment if the garment has the full length intended, or if it even has a seam allowance for folding up the hem, like extra wide seam allowance, not just the seam allowance you need for stitching it. You may need to trim your garment a little shorter to accommodate for the extra length that you're adding with the band. Now we've got our band cut out and folded and pressed in half. And when it comes to choosing the grain line for your band, typically you'll want the grain line to be running across the band the short way, so right straight across this way. You can also have the grain line running in the length, depending on the pattern, the design, if it's striped, if you want to do some kind of design detail that way. But typically you'll want the grain line running this way, and then it will have a little bit more elasticity and a little bit more kind of hold when stretching and reverting back to the original size. Now here I have the sleeve laid out. I have the shoulder seam closed, and then I'm going to close the underarm, the bottom side seam, or the side seam of the top and the bottom of the sleeve all at the same time, just because it's just so much easier to work on flat garments than a round tube. So we'll just start by folding the band up so that all of our seam allowances are aligned, and really we just need to stitch across here. Once again, this seam is going to get more side to side stretch than downward stretch, so I'm going to use a little zigzag stitch here, even though I closed the other seams on this top with a straight lock stitch. Check this out. It's zigzagged on, and when we do tug on it this way, you can see the stitches quite a bit, but when it's just laying smooth, it's a really nice closure. And look how stretchy this is. I can really stretch this jersey really to the max, and my seam isn't breaking or making that popping sound that we're all familiar with when we put a garment on and the seams just crack. So now I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to close this side seam, the sleeve and the underarm, with a straight lock stitch. Fit. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Workshop Wednesday. Be sure to check out my Facebook group if you want a little more sewing inspiration. Sign up for my email list there. I have a few free patterns that you can access. Until next week, take care and happy sewing.